I first noticed the impressions when I was studying photographs of Tartarian bridges for something entirely different. I had been cataloguing decorative flourishes, stone joints, and load-bearing arches. The quiet details historians usually point to when explaining why these structures have survived for centuries. Then my attention caught on something that did not belong to ornamentation or erosion. Shallow at first glance, almost dismissible until the shadows fell at the right angle. 5 depressions, broad, deep, curved where knuckles should be pressed, into stone that should never have yielded that way. I compared older survey images with modern restoration records and realized the markings had never been labeled, never indexed, never explained. Archivists I spoke to described them vaguely as surface irregularities, artifacts of weathering, damage from scaffolding long since removed. None of those answers sat comfortably with what the stone itself was showing me. The bridge was not merely a crossing, it was a witness. Every block had been quarried, hauled, fitted with deliberate force, and somewhere during that process something had pressed its hand into still setting stone and left behind a shape that refused to behave like accident. I measured proportions from photographs, traced outlines onto scale drawings, and found myself hesitating before writing anything definitive. The numbers hovered in my notes without interpretation. Like a door left ajar, whoever built this structure had left more than arches and railings behind. They had left contact. And once you see it, once you follow the curve of those impressions across centuries of surface wear, the bridge stops looking inert. It starts looking like a record. And records, even silent ones, are rarely meaningless. The next step was unavoidable. If the impressions were real, then scale was the only honest place to start. I returned to the same photographs and architectural surveys, overlaying them with measurements taken from preserved sections of the bridge. Stone courses gave reference points. Mortar seams formed grids. Railing heights, step rises, parapet thickness, all the ordinary dimensions engineers rely on when reconstructing vanished scaffolds and lifting frames. When I traced the outlines again, adjusting for camera angle and lens distortion, the proportions refused to behave. A human palm does not spread that wide. Fingers do not leave arcs that long without belonging to a body scale far beyond ordinary frames. I kept recalculating, shifting assumptions, shrinking margins of error, trying to make the numbers cooperate with accepted building practices. They did not. Old masonry manuals described grip tools, tamping methods, surface finishing techniques. None accounted for contact marks of this span. Survey records listed block weights that would require multiple workers using pulleys and sledges, yet the curves in the stone suggested a single downward press, broad and confident, as though leverage had never been an issue at all. Stonemasons appeared only as signatures in payroll books. Engineers surfaced as initials beside load diagrams. Surveyors lingered in faded ink along elevation lines. None left commentary about unusual impressions. None flagged anomalies in the finished surface. Every calculation returned me to the same conclusion I refused to write down. The bridge stayed silent. The numbers did not. To see whether the impressions truly belonged outside accepted explanations, I stepped backward in time and into the official story of how Tartarian bridges were built. Quarry ledges, municipal construction permits, 19th century engineering manuals. They described teams of laborers working in shifts, sledges, and rollers hauling blocks into place. Cranes assembled from timber and rope, surfaces finished with chisels and tamping irons while the stone was still workable enough to take texture. It was orderly, methodical, human in scale. Textbooks credited coordinated crews, incremental force, and carefully staged pause. Archive sketches showed dozens of workers clustered around single spans, pulleys groaning under weight that already pushed. The limits of documented machinery, restoration summaries repeated the same language century after century, describing craftsmanship, patience, and the triumph of civil engineering over terrain. I tried to lay those procedures over what the bridge itself displayed. The curves in the stone refused to align with tool heads. The spread was too broad for a tamping plate, too organic for a finishing blade. If multiple workers had leaned in at once, Their pressure would have overlapped in chaos, not resolved into 5 distinct arcs with consistent depth. Municipal minutes recorded delays, budgets, and stone shipments. They never mentioned unusual surfaces. Inspection reports catalogued cracks, frost damage, settling piers, nothing about impressions that resembled contact. Rather than carving, the official account remained intact on paper. On the bridge, it began to thin. The paperwork was supposed to close the gap. After the construction manuals failed to explain what the stone was showing, I turned toward the records meant to track everything else. Restoration reports, conservation surveys, structural assessments written decades apart by different agencies with no reason to coordinate their language. These documents usually obsess over details. Hairline fractures, weathering patterns, load redistribution after floods, every surface change catalogued, every deviation from original design annotated. Except this one. The impressions were absent, not debated, not misidentified, not even dismissed. They simply did not exist on paper. I followed inspection logs backward through time, looking for the first mention that never came. Marginal notes filled pages about mortar composition and parapet height. Blueprints from later reinforcement projects mapped every pier to the centimeter. Photographic appendices documented stains left by runoff and lichen growth along shaded edges. Where the ham-shaped depressions lay, there was blankness. Curators surfaced only as signatures at the bottom of forms. Archivists appeared as initials beside accession numbers. Their presence was procedural, distant, stripped of commentary. The silence felt uniform, not accidental. The kind produced when something is passed over so routinely that it stops registering as omission. I returned to the bridge again, tracing the same contours I had measured before, now with lists of things inspectors considered worth recording in mind. Hairline cracks mattered. Drainage channels mattered. Centuries-old surface impressions that resisted explanation did not. The gap between stone and archive widened, and in that widening space, suspicion settled into something heavier. Stone does not remember hands. It fractures, it chips, it erodes grain by grain under wind and water until surfaces soften into curves no one intended. What it does not do is compress under pressure and hold that compression in detail for centuries unless something extraordinary happened while it was still workable. That was the problem I kept returning to. The bridge was built from a dense, regional limestone, quarried in blocks heavy enough to challenge modern lifting rigs. Geological surveys described slow-setting material resistant to deformation once exposed to air. In ordinary conditions, even repeated hammer blows leave sharp-edged scars rather than the smooth, rounded cavities I was studying. I read fracture charts, compression thresholds, load distribution tables used by structural engineers when calculating pier collapse. None of them allowed for stone yielding in broad anatomical curves unless the force applied exceeded anything. Documented for hand-driven labor, material scientists had published experiments on plastic deformation in sedimentary rock under extreme pressure, hydraulic presses, industrial loads, controlled laboratory environments. Their conclusions were cautious, technical, careful to avoid speculation. What they demonstrated, again and again, was how difficult it was to produce impressions of that depth without machinery designed specifically to crush. And yet, here they were, 5 depressions, even spacing, subtle tapering at the ends that suggested joints rather than tools. Pressure distributed unevenly, as though weight had shifted mid-contact. I ran through every alternative that would shrink the implication. Soft mortar layers beneath surface courses, post-construction weathering that exaggerated shadow marks into deeper cavities, repairs that blended over earlier damage. None accounted for the geometry. None explained why the surrounding stone remained crisp, while those hollows retained a smoothness that belonged to something pressed, not carved. Physical law was not accusing anyone. It was simply refusing to cooperate, and the only variable left unaccounted for was scale. After geology refused to absorb the anomaly, I turned to the people who were supposed to have been there. Construction leaves paper trails, payroll ledgers, crew rosters, temporary housing permits, census tallies that swell when projects begin and shrink when scaffolds come down. Tartarian municipal archives preserve thousands of such fragments, enough to reconstruct seasonal labor patterns with unsettling precision. Names blurred into totals, totals collapsed into margins of error. But they were there, except where this bridge was concerned. I followed tax rolls through the decade of its construction and found only modest fluctuations, nothing that matched the manpower required to maneuver stone blocks of that size. Port records showed shipments of timber and rope, but no surge in provisions that would accompany hundreds of workers arriving at once. Parish registries recorded births, deaths, marriages, the quiet arithmetic of settlement life. None hinted at a transient population large enough to account for the span rising over the river. The absence was not dramatic. It was administrative. Labor manifests listed crews that felt too small. Census summaries rounded populations that should have spiked. Temporary barracks never appeared on zoning maps. I kept circling back to the same carved surface, to those impressions that refused to behave like tool marks, and asking how many bodies would be required to put them there using documented methods. The records did not argue back. They simply failed to answer. Stone held contact, the paper held nothing at all, and the gap between them widened into something that felt less like oversight and more like erasure in its earliest, quietest form. Once the records began thinning around a single bridge, the responsible move was to assume coincidence. Once they thinned around several, coincidence stopped being a useful word. I widened the search without letting it run ahead of itself. No sweeping maps, no grand declarations, just other spans, attributed to the same Tartarian period. River crossings in provincial towns, arched stone causeways buried beneath later paving, retaining walls that carried traffic long after their designers had disappeared into footnotes. In a handful of restoration photographs, I noticed depressions that shared the same quiet geometry. Broad curves pressed where stone should have fractured. Shallow cavities smoothed by time but shaped too deliberately to decide belonged to erosion alone, not identical, never that clean, similar enough to resist dismissal. Inspection reports followed the same pattern I had already learned to expect. Surface wear acknowledged, structural fatigue noted, decorative irregularities waved away with professional efficiency. None of them lingered where I would have stopped. I began laying images side by side, scaling parapets, matching block courses, tracing hand-width arcs across unrelated structures separated by hundreds of kilometers and decades of documentation. The same question surfaced each time, uninvited and persistent. How many unrelated accidents does it take before repetition becomes a signal? The institutions responsible for preserving these sites appeared only through seals and letterheads, municipal councils, heritage boards, engineering departments, whose language stayed safely procedural. They repaired what cracked. They reinforced what sagged. They did not speculate about contact marks embedded in original stone. The bridge I had started with did not lose its importance. It gained context. What at first looked like a single anomaly now behaved like a member of a larger family, scattered and unattended, connected only by scale and silence. Local puzzle gave way to regional pattern, and patterns, once they form, have a habit of demanding explanations long after the people who created them have stopped speaking. By the time I returned to the official explanations, they no longer felt sturdy enough to lean on. They had not changed. The evidence had. Most accounts remained carefully proportioned. Weathering, tool slippage, decorative experimentation, the occasional misjudged strike during finishing work. Each explanation sounded reasonable in isolation, and I let them stand that way long enough to test them against what had accumulated. Measurements did not recede. Geological constraints stayed fixed. The archival gaps did not refill themselves simply because I wished they would. One theory required stone to compress under forces that modern testing suggested would fracture it instead. Another depended on workers reaching heights and applying pressure inconsistent with the same labor roles that listed their rations, wages, and tools. Restoration reports spoke confidently about surface damage while never addressing why the most dramatic impressions were embedded beneath later layers of masonry. I kept circling the same sequence: dimensions, material behavior, missing documentation. Each rebuttal slid back to those 3 points and stalled. If these were decorative marks, why did they follow anatomical ratios rather than ornamental ones? If they were accidents, why did they repeat across structures separated by geography and administration? If they were well understood, why did the records treat them as though they were not worth naming? The questions were no longer speculative. They were procedural. The kind that appear when an explanation has been asked to carry more weight than it was designed for. At a certain point, silence stops feeling neutral. It begins to feel maintained. Nothing in the archives confessed to uncertainty, yet every page required it. The official narrative still stood on the page, perfectly typeset, footnoted, archived. It simply no longer fit the stone beneath it, and that mismatch, once noticed, refused to shrink. By this point, the question was no longer whether the marks were unusual. It was whether the story built around the bridge had room for what the stone was insisting on. I moved back through the chain in reverse. Geological resistance, tool limits, labor records, restoration layers. Each category had been examined separately by different institutions, in different decades, under different mandates. None of them had been designed to speak to one another. When placed in sequence, they produced something less comfortable than a conclusion. They produced a scale problem. If the impressions were original, the pressure required to create them exceeded what the documented tools could deliver. If the tools were adequate, then the hands applying them were not reflected anywhere in payrolls, census sheets, or housing records. If the workforce lists were complete, then later resurfacing campaigns had quietly altered the visual story, smoothing edges, recutting blocks, reframing depth in ways that nudged perception back toward the familiar. The pattern did not suggest invention. It suggested compression. Later interventions appeared to favor normalization. Repointing mortar, replacing blocks whose contours invited questions. Photographs cropped tighter in subsequent publications. Diagrams redrawn with measurements rounded down rather than up. No single act carried intent on its own. Together, they leaned in the same direction, toward smaller, toward manageable, toward builders whose proportions fit comfortably inside modern expectations. I resisted the urge to name what that implied, not because the idea was dramatic, but because it was too large to approach carelessly. The stone was already doing enough speaking. What unsettled me was not the possibility of extraordinary stature, but the calm efficiency with which extraordinary scale seemed to dissolve once it passed through enough institutional hands. Systems remained in the foreground. Individuals never appeared, and the bridge, unchanged beneath centuries of reinterpretation, continued to hold a shape the written record could not comfortably carry. I stood back from the numbers, the tests, the records, and returned to the only thing that had never revised itself. The stone. Centuries of weather had softened its edges, repairs had altered its surface, explanations had layered themselves over it in increasingly careful language. Yet the impressions remained shallow enough to overlook, distinct enough to persist, shaped in a way that refused to resolve into ornament or accident. The bridge had not offered confirmation. It had offered resistance. Every attempt to finalize the story collapsed into the same absence. No builders named, no workforce described at the necessary scale, no survey that lingered where the depressions curved inward, only maintenance logs, structural diagrams, paragraphs that stopped just before the most conspicuous detail. I found myself asking a single restrained question, one I could not make smaller. What does it mean when the object under study outlives every explanation placed upon it? The hand-shaped voids remained embedded in their courses, quiet and unyielding, mirrored in other structures, scattered across the same forgotten networks of construction. not proof, something more difficult, a space in the record shaped exactly like what no one seems prepared to describe.